Good morning, everyone. My name is Mel Hartley, and I am the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I would like to welcome you to this workshop, Internal Audit. This is a new workshop and it is part one of a three-part series, which will be run at this time over the next 2 Mondays. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And we would like to respectfully acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people on whose land we meet today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Werner, who is our presenter for today and for the remainder of this series. Thank you very much, Claire. Over to you.
Thanks, Mel, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see you. I'm here on a Monday morning, or if you're joining us from the eastern states, might already be afternoon for you. So we have a three-part series where we're going to have a look at our internal audit, and really what we're doing in today's session is giving you a bit of an overview of the structure of those three webinars that we're going to deliver. We're going to have a look at the requirements of the standards for RTOs as they are today. We will talk about the benefits of internal audit for your organisations. We will look at the process, an overview of the process of internal audits. We are going to talk about the tools that you could use to conduct an internal audit. And if you have the luxury of choosing your internal auditor, who would make a great internal auditor in your organisation. So as Mel has said in the, sorry, I'm just seeing all the messages about you joining and I'm seeing lots of familiar names in there. So hello to all of you that I know. As Mel mentioned, we're going to use some handouts over the three sessions. The participants handout will cover all three of the sessions, so there's only one participant handout. We will start to use that today. And you will also have a fact sheet, a new fact sheet that we have developed about internal audits. That one's called the Internal Audit Guide. And that fact sheet is really designed to work with these three series of webinars. So there'll be things that we talk about in the webinar where there's more information in the fact sheet. And there are then some things in the fact sheet that we won't talk about in the webinars, but are important for you to understand and use in your organisations. So they're very much complementary. And within the handouts that you got, you would have also had a file that had some other documents in it, some marketing tools and things like that. And we're going to use those next week when we do the webinar. First of all, let's look at the structure of these webinars. We got some feedback over the questionnaires that were asked. You know, we're always asking for feedback about what you would like. And we got some feedback that you would really like webinars focused on internal audit. So these three webinars in the fact sheet are the response to the requests that have come from the sector. Our session today is really an overview and looking at those very early planning things that happen in an internal audit process. Session 2 focuses on the process, and we're going to use case study, which is what's in the files that you have got. You don't have to do any homework. You don't have to pre-read it. It'll all be okay looking at it in the session. But next session is focused on that process. And then our final session is focused on how you use the information that you get in internal audits for improvement processes, because that's really what it is all about in our sector, improvement. Okay, so in our current regulation, there's this real focus on quality assurance. And while the standards don't specifically say you need to conduct an internal audit, it's certainly one way for your organisation to collect information about how things are working in your organisation and use that for quality assurance processes. So there are two clauses in our standards as they are today that are really focused or where an internal audit could help. And those standards are 2.1 and 2.2, and they're in the quality assurance cluster of clauses. You've got them on the screen in front of you, and you also have them on page 1 of your handout, so you can refer to them if you would like to. So clause 2.1 is really making or asking the RTOs to ensure that they comply with these standards at all times. And an internal audit is probably the most common way that RTOs decide whether they are actually achieving their goals and whether they're complying with these standards. And, you know, RTOs have all different shapes, sizes, and forms. And internal audit can look very different depending upon what type of organisation you're in. Across Australia, we have RTOs that are 1-person RTOs, 2-person RTOs, 10-person RTOs, 1,000-person RTOs. We have private RTOs, we have public RTOs, we have some very big TAFE organisations in Australia. We have very large commercial providers, we have online providers, we have enterprise RTOs. And so what's done in audit, how it's done, the scale of the audits vary dramatically based on the kind of RTO that you actually are. So there's no one way to do internal audits. What we have to decide when we are planning these things is what's actually going to work in our organisation. And we hope that the information that you get out of these sessions is going to give you enough information to make that decision. Clauses 2.2 A and B really ask you to use the information that you collect about your RTO. So some of it is mandatory evaluation information that you have to collect, but internal audit is another way of collecting information about your organisation. And they ask you to use that information to make sure that you improve what you do and how your organisation is operating. So nowhere in the regulation does it say do an internal audit, but it is another tool for you to use to have a look, to have an objective look at how your organisation is working and decide if there are things that you can do better. So deciding if you are compliant with our regulatory standards or not is really only one of the things that an internal audit can do for you. There are in fact a lot of benefits of doing an internal audit that we don't often think about. This next slide lists some of those for you. So first of all, we'll look at the learning opportunities that might be provided to your organisation as a result of internal audit. So one of the things when you do an internal audit is you get a really objective review of the systems and processes in your organisation and how they are working. And that's a really invaluable learning opportunity for your organisation. But when you do that, you have to do it with an open mind and a growth mindset. If you have a very fixed idea about what's working or not working in your organisation, that'll be what you find. So it's a little bit like seeing the wood for the trees. You know, when you are in an organisation and you see it every day and you know what happens, it can sometimes colour the way you think. So when you do these internal audits, try and take a step back and look more broadly at what's working or not working in your organisation. Internal audits really give you the opportunity to look at your internal controls. And so they're like checkpoints that exist within your organisation, and to strengthen those checkpoints. So you might be looking at systems, you might be looking at processes, and when you're looking at these controls, you're looking to see if they're well designed and whether they are always giving you the type of outcome that you're looking for, irrespective of who's using it. Now, within the VEC sector, we have a few processes that are built into every training organisation, which are about internal controls. validation is probably a great example of that. It is a process that is set up to check that our assessments are being done properly. Every organisation does it, and the idea is that we protect the integrity of our system by checking that the assessment processes are working. Internal audits can help you promote efficiency in your organisation. When you are having a look at how your systems and processes are working, it's really easy to pick up redundancies or duplications in what it is you are doing, and look for ways to reduce that. And so certainly last week we were in an organisation where there was absolutely nothing wrong with the processes that we're using, but when we look at them end to end, we can actually see, well, we've already got that information there, we've already got this information there. Couldn't we put these things together and make it a more streamlined process? So efficiencies are often something that arise out of RTOs conducting internal audits. And of course, ideally, they will increase the effectiveness of your organisation as well, because this is where we have a look and see if these processes are actually achieving the outcomes that they're supposed to achieve. And in an internal audit process, of course, you can come up with recommendations for how to change or tweak those processes so that they do become more effective. Those of you who have known me for a long time will have probably heard me say this, like, we want to make sure that your RTO achieves its goals because of what you do, not in spite of what you do. And that's about effectiveness. So sometimes, as just a happy accident, we achieve the outcome, and it's more about maybe the person that was involved or doing it, rather than the process that we have put in place to make sure we always achieve those outcomes. So increasing effectiveness of your organisation is a very typical and really important benefit to doing internal audits. Accountability is not one that we often think about, because it's something that we almost take for granted, but it's actually something we do need to have conversations about. And internal audits are a way of enabling those discussions in the workplace. There's two comments that I hear a lot in audits that pretty much tell me straight away that there is an accountability issue in the organisation. First of those is, that's above my pay grade, or I don't get paid enough to do that. And the second one is, oh, that happened before I got here. So when we think about those statements, they might be true. In fact, they often are. But in this instance, that's above my pay grade, or I don't get paid enough to do that. It is still your responsibility to let the right people know that there is an issue. And if you have some suggestions for how they might be able to address those things, to pass those suggestions to whoever the right people are, because it's all of our responsibility to actually identify what's working and what's not working. And in the second instance, again, it can be quite true that this was set up or happened before you got there, but it's your job now. And so your job is actually to address the issues that exist within your scope of responsibility. So internal audits are a way of, you hear those things, it allows you to have the discussion and then address those issues. Internal audits are really great for managing risk. They allow you to identify all kinds of risks for your organisation and to figure out whether, one, you have risk mitigations in place for those risks, and two, whether those mitigations are actually working as you intended them to do. So again, an internal audit report can give you lots of advice about how to address those issues, which is something you wouldn't necessarily get in an external audit report. Improving compliance, it almost goes without saying. But the idea that internal audits will check that you are meeting all of your obligations, and that could be legal obligations, it could be regulatory obligations, it could be funding obligations, it could be your compliance with industry standards. The internal audit allows you to actually have that look and decide whether you are meeting all those obligations, and again, improving if you are not. And the last one that we've got on there is strengthening security. Now, cybersecurity is something that is all over the news at the moment. It's becoming increasingly important as we use many more online systems. In RTOs, we hold all kinds of data about people. We have personal information about individuals. And sometimes it's quite in-depth personal information that you have about an individual. So we need to make sure that, when we look at the systems that we use, that we look at our cybersecurity and make sure the environment that we are operating in is as secure as it can possibly be. So it might simply be even, who is actually using digital devices. We might all have a desktop computer in front of us, but in fact our trainers and assessors who are out on the road download information to their phones or to their iPads or whatever device they might be using. Are they using those in line with our policy in the same way that they might use their desktop computer in line with our policy? So it allows you to look at that, to look for vulnerabilities that exist within your system and think about how you might be able to close those gaps. So many reasons why internal audits can be helpful for you, and this is probably not an exhaustive list, but it's a great starting point. So compliance is not the only reason why we would do internal audits. Now, when we do internal audits, when we do any audit, in fact, it doesn't matter whether it is an external audit, whether it's an internal audit that's done by someone from within your organisation. It might even be an external internal audit where you might bring someone from outside your organisation into the organisation for the sole purpose of doing an audit. Doesn't matter who does it. There are some audit principles that should be in place and guide what it is we do. So first of all, the audits should be systematic. And what this means is that typically they're based on some form of sampling strategy, with the idea being that what you sample in an audit will actually represent the broader pattern of behaviour in the organisation's operations. So if you think of a big organisation, and we'll just pick a TAFE as an example, like if we picked one of our big metropolitan TAFEs, they can have up to 1,000 training products on their scope, qualifications, skill sets, units of competency, accredited courses. There is no way that that organisation can audit every single one of those qualifications. They have to sample. So when we think about what we're going to sample, we have to make sure that we do it in a systematic way. And next session, we're going to talk about our risk. And this is one of the things that would help us choose what it was that we were going to sample. Systematic ways also mean that the audits are planned, that everyone knows about them, that everyone knows what to expect, that the audit team are aware of their roles and responsibilities, and they conduct their audits in a consistent way. So in bigger organisations, obviously that task is much broader. If you're a one-person or two-person or small organisation, that task becomes a little simpler. We have to make sure that our audits are outcome focused, our standards are outcomes focused. That means that they, in most cases, don't tell you how to do something, they just tell you what the outcome has to be. So, for example, you make sure that you identify student needs and you put a program in place that is going to suit their needs. So they're not telling you how to do that. Each organisation will decide how they do that, and that how is about the size and scope of the organisation, what the resources are, what the capability is, who the client group is. We just look at the outcome in regulation. When you are looking at internal audits, the outcome is also your starting point. So your audit process actually reviews evidence about what has been achieved. In most cases, we're going to be doing against the standards for RTOs, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach to compliance. So what we're looking at is whether the systems that you have put in place in your RTO are achieving the goals. Now, the auditor is going to consider whether that evidence that is being provided meets the requirements of the standards and clauses in the RTOs, and whether the results were achieved through that planned systematic deployment of those systems within your organisation. When you get to a situation where you go, oh, that didn't work as we intended it to, this is where you see the real difference between internal and external audit processes. In an external audit process, we're going to say, this process didn't work, it hasn't achieved the outcomes, please go away and fix it. So we're not going to tell you how to do anything in particular, or we're not going to dig in and figure out exactly why it didn't work. That's a job for you. In an internal audit process, that's the whole idea, that you do dig in and go, wow, this process didn't work. Let's figure out what went wrong. And you'll be able to then figure out as an organisation what you might need to do to actually address whatever it was that went wrong. When we are looking at audits, it's about it being evidence-based. And again, doesn't matter what kind of audit you are doing, it's important that it's evidence-based. So all of our audit findings are actually based, or entirely based, on the evidence that is presented to the auditor. So when an auditor is thinking about whether that evidence meets all of the requirements, they're really asking questions that you will be very, very familiar with. So many of you who might also work as a trainer and assessor would be aware of the rules of evidence, that something is valid, sufficient, authentic, and current. Now, those same rules apply in an audit process. So when we are looking at evidence that's been provided, we're saying, is it valid evidence? Does it actually reflect the requirements that sit in the standard or clause that we are auditing? Is that evidence sufficient? Does it sufficiently address the requirements, allowing us to make a fair and reasonable judgment about whether someone is compliant or not? Is it authentic? Is it genuine, real, and related to actual practice? And some of you might be going, well, why wouldn't it be genuine and real? So I can tell you that it's decreasing now, but certainly in the past, there are organisations that basically run two systems. There's one where they generate evidence for an audit, and there's one that represents how they actually operate on a day-to-day basis. To me, that seems like an awful lot of work, but it's also, it's not authentic. What you see in the evidence that's prepped for audit is not how the organisation actually operates. So when you are looking at evidence, make sure that it is reflective of the actual practice in the organisation. And then the other thing that you're going to need to check is whether it is current evidence, and so it's relevant to the operations of that provider today. So, some examples of things like that might be where you see industry engagement evidence that might be 3 or 4 years old. is that evidence that could still be considered current today? Probably not. So make sure that whatever you're looking at is reflective of current practice. Being flexible really means that we don't have this one idea of how things happen. And again, this is going to vary depending on the size of your organisation, the scope of what you do. If you are a small RTO and you have maybe 3 or 4 units of competency on your scope, maybe you do everything the same for those 4 units of competency. If you are a TAFE, it is likely that things happen slightly differently in the different industry areas because they're designed to work with the client group that's relevant for that industry area. So when you're doing an internal audit, it's important to acknowledge the diversity of what you might see. And remember that we've got don't have the one size fits all. We don't even have the one size fits most. We are looking for, in those areas, in the way they're doing things, are they actually working? And it might mean that you would consider things that you wouldn't typically see. Being fair, open and transparent means that everyone's really fully informed about the audit process. And again, this can look very different in a small organisation. If it's a 2-person organisation, we might decide that tomorrow we're going to sit down and we're going to have a look at a particular part of what we do, and we're fully informed. If I am in a bigger organisation where they have an audit schedule and it's different teams, they have a dedicated audit team, then the communication about, hey, there's going to be an audit and this is what it's going to look at and this is how it's going to happen, will look very different. So whoever's going to be involved in that audit, they need to understand that that's going to happen. They need to make sure, the auditor, needs to make sure that they understand what's going to be looked at. So it might be what clauses, what documents, what area. They need to be given the opportunity to ask any questions and clarify things, including that there might be a conflict of interest in bigger organisations. There's often conflicts of interest before that audit happens. When you are in those bigger organisations, you might also decide to talk to students or talk to employers or other stakeholders about what it is you are doing. And again, that audit process would need to be communicated to those people as well, so that they understand what their role is. So one thing is letting everybody know, but the other thing is also letting people understand how you're going to make decisions about compliance or non-compliance, what kind of information is going to come back to them, when that might be going to come back to them, how you will go about fixing things if there's any problem. So it's about making sure everyone understands the process and can contribute to that process. When you don't know what people are looking for or what the focus is, it's sometimes very hard to actually provide the kind of information that would actually make the audit process a fair process. So irrespective of the kinds of audits that we're conducting, these principles should underpin everything that we do. So let's talk a little bit more about the process itself. What could this process look like? Well, no matter the size or scale of the audit, pretty much these 5 steps would always be involved in any audit process that we might undertake. They can look very different in different organisations, but they tend to still be there. Today, we are really going to focus on bubble 1 and 2. 3 and 4 is next webinar, and 5 is the last webinar. So planning is really the first step in all of this, and planning is really often about the logistics of enabling an audit to run smoothly and to actually achieve the objective of the audit. So these questions that are sitting here are also listed in your handout. They're on page 2 of your handout. And as we talk about each of these questions, the table that's in your handout gives you an opportunity to write down key information that would then help you decide what this means for your audit and your planning process. So when we're talking about that first question, what's the objective and the scope of the audit, it's really about why am I actually conducting this audit? So in an RTO's context, that might be something like you're going to change your scope of registration and you want to see if what you're planning to submit to the regulator is going to meet all of those requirements. Maybe you've had a complaint about a training product or a service that you offer, and you want to test out whether that's a one-off thing or whether there's actually a hole in the processes in your organisation and something that you need to address. Maybe you've had a new IT system implemented in your organisation, and you want to check that it's performing as it's intended to. So the reasons why you are doing the audit would change what you look at in the audit. So if you think about that first example of putting a new training product on scope, probably the clauses that you are going to focus on are the clauses that, or a subset of the clauses that sit in Standard 1, because that's the standard that's about the training and assessment. You might also choose to look at how you're going to market that new qualification. So we're not looking at everything, we're just looking at a subset of the clauses that are relevant to what we're trying to achieve. If you're implementing a new IT system, then you might look at each process that that IT system touches and audit the relevant clauses for those processes. If you had a complaint, whatever the nature of the complaint was, they would be the subset of clauses that you would have a look at in an internal audit. So figuring out what the objective and what the scope is a really important thing to allow you to focus your efforts. The next question, what are we going to look at and when is this going to happen, is about you being specific. So within the scope of your audit, it's starting to narrow it down. So let's take the example of a new IT system. So let's say you are using that IT system to maybe store all of your assessment tools and records, and you just happen to be a big RTO that has a scope of 20 or 30 qualifications or more. You're not going to be able to look at all of those qualifications. So how are you going to sample from what you are offering? So you might choose, for example, qualifications or training products that are offered through different pathways. So you might have some that are done institutionally and some that are done via traineeships. So you might make sure you get both of those so that you can see how that system is working for the different types of offerings that you have. So what are you going to look at? It allows you to narrow that down and use your sampling strategy, whatever that strategy is. And then when you start to think about that, you start to think about where is this going to happen? So are there multiple sites that I might need to travel to? If that's the case, it might affect when it has to happen. Here in Western Australia, a very large state and a big proportion of our state is impacted by weather. So when you're going to the northwest, you do not want to be going up there midsummer unless you love baking in 45 degrees, or going further north into the wet season, you know, there's significant challenges to going into the Kimberley in the wet season. So where you're going to go to, where those sites might be, will impact things like travel, timings, and when that might happen. If you're deciding to go and talk to employers and you're going to go onto employers' sites, you might also have to consider whether you have to do a site induction. Now, some of those site inductions are done online. Some of them involve you sitting in a room for a couple of hours listening to all the rules and regulations around being on a particular site. So deciding that scope and who's going to be involved and where you're going to do it will often have some significant logistical implications for your audit. Now, in that same process, thinking about the staff that are involved, you might have to work with rosters. If you're going to look at employees and students aren't always on site. How are you going to access those students? Who's going to be a great contact person for you to get access to people? It could be quite a complex task. In a small ITO, that task is going to be much simpler. I might walk out of my office and I will be with the students. So you need to apply it in the way that it's right for you. A really important thing to think about if you're going to go to sites is what you can look at before a site visit. The reason that question is so important is because when you're going onto a site, one, you are touching people's very busy lives and they're giving you time to do that audit. So you don't really want to be sitting on site reading things. When you're on site, you actually want to be talking to people or going and seeing what's happening, like watching the training and assessment, seeing the workshops, seeing all of the equipment that's there. So understanding enough about how the operations are happening that you can request the right kinds of things for you to see before you go onto site becomes really important. Letting them know what you do need to see when you're on site so that they can plan that and have the right people there available to talk to you. The other thing when you are on site is thinking about, and even in a desktop, thinking about how much information is going to come to you. In any training and assessment audit, there's a lot of written information that comes. There's a lot of people that you talk to, and your brain needs time to actually consider all of that information to, one, figure out if you have enough information to make a decision, and if you don't have enough information to make a decision, what else you might need to see. That doesn't typically happen like that. You need to actually give yourself, build time into your schedule to give yourself time to consider the evidence that you've seen and what else you might need to see. When you have the vast majority of answers to these questions, typically you will then put some kind of audit schedule in place. So this example is a really simple example of what might happen in a day on an audit. So we've got basically an 8:30 to 4 type audit happening here, where we're looking at a couple of different qualifications in the business training package, and you can see for both of those qualifications we've allocated about 2 hours to look at a subset of standards around the delivery of the qualification. In the morning in this schedule, we have looked at some other parts of the standards. We're looking at standards 2 to 8, which is the quality assurance and governance and engagement with or marketing information. And we're also having a look at a couple of the parts of standard 1. So Understanding what the focus area is allows organisations to put the right people in place. If this was internal and you knew, as in you are very familiar with the area, you might actually be able to write down which staff were required. If this was in a bigger organisation, probably the area that's going to be audited would need to tell you what staff were going to be there. So a very simple schedule that actually lays out for everyone what is going to happen when. These schedules should be negotiated with the people that are being audited. I certainly, when I'm doing it myself, I'll often draft a schedule and I'll send it to the people that I'm auditing saying, does this work for you? If it doesn't, what needs to change? And eventually we'll get to a point where we're agreed on what is going to happen when. And sometimes those time issues are harder than others. So you might have or be talking to a trainer and assessor, and you need to schedule that outside when they're actually conducting their training. So where if I'm talking to an administrative person, they might be more flexible in the time. It doesn't matter if we go a bit over. Sometimes for the trainers and assessors, they have hard deadlines that we have to keep to. So sometimes things will happen more quickly than you expect. Sometimes things will take a lot longer than you expect, but generally people have an idea of what is going to happen. And when you know that things are going to go much longer, it's just common courtesy to actually let people know that the timing is a little bit out and we might be starting half an hour late or an hour later than we planned. So we have a schedule, and the next thing that we need to think about is the tools that we will actually use to conduct the audit. Now, audit tools are really important, and probably the most important line on this slide is the last one, that it has to work for you. All of our brains work differently, and you might be a person who has an incredible memory and can remember all of the details of things weeks after you've seen someone and talked to them about what they do. You might be a person whose memory works really well when you just have dot points, and that's enough to trigger your memories of what it was that you were seeing. You might also be a person who needs a bit of detail and contextual information to actually recall what it is you've seen and what you have talked about. That's me. When I do an audit to when I might write a report for someone, sometimes that's a week or 2 weeks later, and I've worked on 5 or 10 different things in that time frame. And so going back to think about what I saw in the audit means that I have to have some really good notes from that audit process to actually help me write that report. So the way your brain works and how your job operates is really going to influence what kind of audit tool will work for you. There is no one right tool, and what you will find is that even the regulators don't specify a tool, they specify how the report has to happen. So you're going to develop tools that work for you in your organisation. And we've actually got 3 examples for you to have a look at. They're all very different. This first one is a very detailed tool where each of the documents in this organisation, we're checking for very specific things in the documents. So a large team of internal auditors, and we want them all to be looking for and doing the same things. So there's a lot of specification in this tool, and it's encouraged them to check for details in the documents and make notes against every criterion. Again, this is the kind of tool that's also designed for very specific documents within the organisation. They know exactly what they require everyone to do, so they can build that into the tool. If you know your documents and processes and everyone is required to do things in the same way, you could do the same kind of thing and that kind of information can be incorporated into your tool. The second example, for all of you who are registered with ASQA, you'll be very familiar with this. So this is a tool which asks some very general questions about your systems and processes, how you do particular things, and then what evidence you have got that actually demonstrates there is an outcome. If you have opportunities for improvement, which of course means you're compliant, but you just want to make an improvement, you can record those. And if you think you're non-compliant and you have to take action, you can also list those. So some really generic questions for you to answer there. And our third example is also generic, but it gives a bit more suggestion. So this is the kind of tool that you could send to an area that you are auditing, and they could use it as a self-reflection tool first, and then you could use it in your internal audit. So it picks out the clauses, it talks about the kinds of evidence that might be there. Then you get to write down what evidence you did see. So that might be a document that's been provided to you. It might be an interview that you have conducted with somebody. And then you have an opportunity to make comments or write about your findings, make a decision whether it's compliant or not, and list any actions. So the tool that you use, and I'm going to go back to that line again, that really important thing is it's a tool that you can use effectively to be able to write a good audit report for the people that you are auditing. And so, of course, once we have the tool, the other part of thinking about that is thinking about who is actually doing these audits. Now, I mentioned right up front that there are many times when you will not have the luxury of choosing who might be involved in doing your internal audits. But if you do have the luxury of choosing your internal audit team, then there are some things that you should be looking for. So the first thing is that internal auditor has to show integrity. They have to be able to reach objective and constructive resolutions with the people that are being audited. So they have to be able to analyse information, they have to be able to provide advice, they need to be able to influence people, and that can be throughout every level of the organisation that you're dealing with. And when you come across resistance, they need to be able to address that in a really effective way as well. Part of enabling that, of course, to happen is that they have to be effective communicators. It's critical. Like if there was, we typically don't pick out anything as more important than others, but if you didn't have those first two that are on this list, you would have a significant problem when it came to internal audits. So when we're talking about communication, it is not just being able to talk with people, it's also being able to communicate effectively in a written way as well. There is normally an audit report that comes out of an audit process, and that report has got to be understandable to the people who are going to read it and use it to address anything. So we want people who are clear and succinct in the way that they communicate. They've got to be good at taking vast amounts of information and like getting to the core of what is being said. Part of that is linked to the next one. They've got to be able to build collaborative relationships, because audits do not work if the people that you're auditing won't talk to you. So being able to build rapport and trust with the people that they are auditing becomes incredibly important. So internal auditors are also people, good internal auditors are people who are always learning. The reality is we work in an environment that changes sometimes daily, weekly, monthly, And we need auditors who are going to remain curious and are going to take those insights that they get from that curiosity and learning and be able to use it to inform their process. So generally, people who are constantly asking what if questions are great people to consider. And in all of that learning, a key task for auditors today is really being able to leverage data to manage risk. Managing risk is incredibly important. No organisation works perfectly all the time. There are always little things that are not quite working as you intend. The thing to figure out is which one of those have got the opportunity to impact significantly in your organisation. So often you will need to look at large amounts of data and coalesce that data into something that is usable to help you manage that risk, not only in figuring out where to focus, but in figuring out what to do. And you will often need lots of other people to help you do that. So again, people who are team-oriented are really helpful in an internal audit situation, and they will often also need to be innovative and strategic. Often when we think of internal auditors, we think of people who are very detailed focused, and there is no doubt that that is helpful. When you are very detailed focused, though, what can happen, doesn't always happen, but what can happen is you lose that bigger picture. So you're focusing on all these tiny little bits of things, and you actually lose that bigger picture, which it becomes important when you think about efficiency and effectiveness in systems. So no issue having the detail focus, just make sure you also have that broader strategic focus as well, and that you can look at what is happening in your environment, take that data, use it to figure out the best way for your organisation to move forward. Ideally, your internal auditors will also be technical experts. So for example, you wouldn't want me doing a building construction audit. I can't look at the structural integrity of a building and tell you whether it's okay or not. I can look at training and assessment and tell you whether it's okay or not. So when you're picking your internal audit team, if possible, pick trainers and assessors, pick people who understand the business of your organisation. There are times when you might want to bring in a technical expert from outside. You might be in a bigger organisation where you could potentially use some of your industry people to also have a look at the things that you are doing, and there's again some real advantage to that. So we get to a situation where we have an objective and a scope for our audit. We've got a plan for how it's going to happen. We have the tools that we're going to use to conduct the audit, and we've picked who our internal auditors are going to be. We're well along the track to figuring out how to conduct this internal audit. So in our next webinar, what we're going to do is, again, we'll come back and we'll touch again on the objectives and scope for the audit in relation to the case study, so we see it in practice. The kinds of preparations that we might need to do for that audit, again, seeing it in practice through that case study. We're going to think about the evidence that we might gather for a desktop review, and we've got a couple of examples that are sitting in that folder that are going to relate to the case study that we look at. We'll spend a lot of time talking about how to evaluate evidence and make the audit decision, whether we're looking at compliance or not. And we're also going to talk about briefing the people who are being audited, and we'll talk about that in the sense of what you might do in that first opening meeting of the audit process, but also how to talk to the auditees in a closing or a debriefing meeting from the audit. So a couple of things. Firstly, are there any questions that you would like to ask? I have absolutely been talking at you for an hour. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat box and we'll see if we can answer them. And to let you know that we have some opportunities for you to follow up on what it is we have talked about, in that we've got the next 2 sessions that are coming up on the 22nd and 29th of May, so Monday next week and the week after. TAC also has a lot of information available for RTOs on their YouTube channel, and we have some podcasts that might also be helpful for you. And of course, if you have the opportunity to read the fact sheet, please do so. I think there's a lot of things in there that you will find. TAC is always available for you to talk to them. Their contact details are there. And if you have any feedback at all about the session, things that you think we could do better, or tweak, as Mel said, this is number 1. Please let us know, and we would love to have your feedback. So most people are saying no, they don't have any questions, but if that's the case, then I'm probably going to say farewell to you today. Thank you so much for joining us. I will keep looking at your questions as we go and answer them, but for those of you who don't, hopefully we'll see you in our next workshop Monday of next week. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy your day.